question mark. You know, I've done a series now and then on women heroes of the Bible. I have a question mark here. Is this woman a hero? Is she a prophet? There's a couple of ways to interpret, at least two ways to interpret this story. And one of them, well, again, I'm going to talk about both of them. I'll tell you, I talked with Marta, Katie, my wife Marta is an Episcopal priest, so she and I talk about my sermons. She's in the Army, and I help her with her Army stuff. So it's a good kind of working relationship, if you will. She said, you might want to be careful. She said, I've never preached on this in 25 years. Because it can be misinterpreted if you're preaching some process theology. But she said, I think your folks at Kirkpatrick, I think they're going to get this, and they're not going to be offended. So we'll see. If you get offended, please don't go run screaming out the back. Just come to me and say, I really was offended by your sermon. And that's okay. There's one way to interpret this. So, Jesus is tired, and he goes to Tyre and Sidon, which is in Canaan, and he tries to hide, and he finally finds a house. I can imagine him closing the door, and he finally flops down into a chair. And then this Canaanite woman comes in and starts begging. And his disciples say, send her away, for heaven's sakes. We're Jews. We're God's chosen people. Send her away. Not only that, she's a woman. And as we know, in those days, women were property. If you were a woman, you didn't speak to a man. And men don't speak to women. Certainly not. That's not your wife or your sister. And this woman is coming to the master and asking for something. And it's a big deal. And the disciples say, send her away. And let me have one. Why would the disciples continue to tell this story? Mark was probably written somewhere around 55, 60 AD. So 3 decades after Jesus is crucified. Why would they continue to tell this story for at least 25, 30 years? It doesn't make Jesus look very good, does it? I mean, he calls this woman a dog and says, go away. And he seems to be taking the side of the Jews over the Canaanites by saying, we're the chosen people. I have to take care of my people first. Why would he do that? Obviously, the disciples feel or felt this was an important story. There's something here that's very important. There's one interpretation, we have one, and I think our play kind of went into this morning with Kate's play. Jesus, the divine wisdom teacher. So Jesus goes to Tyre and Sidon, and he knows ahead of time that there's going to be a woman there, and that she is going to ask him for something. And he's going to use this little play on words because he knows exactly what this woman is thinking. And humiliate her or not, he's going to use this to teach the disciples about their own bigotry and racism. And he does. And it's successful. Because Jesus is a divine wisdom teacher. Jesus is fully human, fully God. Jesus is omniscient and knows everything ahead of time. That is one interpretation. And that's probably one that most of us are familiar with and probably most comfortable with. There's another one that's maybe a little less comfortable. Let me have another one. We see in Scripture that Jesus changed, didn't he? He not only grew from a boy to a man, but he grew in wisdom and stature, which would seem to indicate that Jesus was able to learn things. This is Jesus in the temple when he's 12 years old. Was this woman a prophetess? And did she teach Jesus something in this moment? Let me have one more. So if we follow the storyline, just before this, Jesus is in the temple, and the Pharisees are criticizing Jesus because his disciples eat without doing the ritual hand washing. And Jesus calls them all kind of nasty names and says, You and your traditions, your Jewish traditions, enough is enough. Don't you see that it is not what goes into the body that defiles, it is what comes out. Shake loose of your Jewish myopic view of the world. And then what? 1 verse later, or 5 verses later, he's calling a woman a dog because she's from Canaan? What's going on here? I'm going to tell you, I don't know the answer. This is the wonderful thing about theology. And any pastor that stands up here and starts beating the pulpit and telling you this is what thus says the Lord, and this is what you must believe, other than our conclusion, I think, is pretty clear. I think you ought to be wary, or we ought to be wary. I don't have the answer, but I'm going to present another interpretation. Let me have one more. So Jesus tells the Pharisees, break out of your worldview a little bit. It's not just about Jews. I came for everyone, Jew and Greek, pagan, everyone, even the Canaanites, our sworn enemy for hundreds of years. I mean, they were really like dogs. Some commentators say that the Greek word that Jesus uses is actually meant to mean little dogs. Like, he was saying it little dogs because the pagans like to have dogs as pets. And so he called her a little dog, and so it's actually an affectionate term. No, the word is dog. He calls her a dog. What's going on here? And then what happens? He says it's not right to take the children's food and feed it to the dogs. And what happens? But Lord, even the dogs. Do you see how cleverly she twists it? She doesn't shrink. She's not shamed. She hangs right in there with him, a woman, and she cleverly puts it right back to him. In this interpretation, and there's others, look at Jesus' mother and the wedding at Cana. Jesus says, my time hasn't come. And his mother says, just do what he tells you. And she pushes him along in his mission. Does this woman teach Jesus something through her cleverness and her persistence? We have one more, Kenny. In this interpretation, this woman is a prophetess. She's clever. And she, in effect, kind of uses Jesus' own words to get what she wants, what she needs, which is the healing for her daughter. And we see instantly in this interpretation that Jesus self-corrects, and he, in essence, says, you know what, you're right. For saying that, you may go. It would be a really big deal for a man to say, you know what, woman, you're right. Does Jesus do that? We have one more. As I start to wrap up here, it seems to me that the message here is ultimately God is a God for all people. Jew, Gentile, pagan, Greek. You can't help where you were born, who your parents are, what your traditions are. Jesus' message ultimately becomes, I am here for everyone, because God, everyone is a child of God. How we get there, to me, seems a little less important. When I was a kid, we had this friend, Dr. Joe, I won't use his last name, even though he's died, and I won't use his last name. Dr. Joe. Dr. Joe was Egyptian. And he drove, does anybody remember those old Mercedes-Benz? They had only 2 seats, and they were a ragtop, a convertible. Anybody remember this? Joe Hasbani was an OBGYN. And he loved to party, and he loved to drive fast. And we would see Dr. Joe on our way to school in the mornings. And Dr. Joe we'd see him, and he'd be one of those guys that's weaving in and out of traffic, desperate to get there first. And if he had a baby to deliver at 8:30 in the morning, he would squeal into the hospital, I'm sure, at 8:29 and 30 seconds. And I remember my dad used to, we'd go driving along Roosevelt Boulevard, and we'd be in the center lane. And my dad would say, just watch Dr. Joe. And my dad would just drive 45 miles an hour. And Joe's squealing around, jumping in and out of cars, jumping in front of people. And don't you find this to be true? If those of us who've gotten a little older, excuse me. If you just hang out in the right-hand lane a lot of times, you end up getting there first. If you just sort of chill out, and we'd get up about 2/3 of the way, and we'd slowly ease by Dr. Joe, and he'd be beating on the steering wheel. I do the same thing. I try to do the same thing. I'm not always patient enough, but as I get off going to my house in Caldwell, I think is it 10th Street or 10th Avenue? Is it 10th Street? It goes, yeah, so I take a right off of the expressway and go down, right down at the College of Idaho, right? Turn left. I found that if you just get in the left-hand lane as you go by Albertsons and, is it Linden Boulevard? And you'll slowly creep by everyone. And then I slowly get over and turn right on Lake Avenue. I kind of look at this story in Scripture as, let me have one more, Kate, as kind of relaxing into our lives with God and our relationship with God and our relationship with Scripture. We can beat on the steering wheel like crazy, trying to control the message and control God and control what the meaning is. Or we can be more contemplative about the whole thing and hang out in the right-hand lane and just let God be God. One of my favorite theologians you know is Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And on this topic, Fred says, God is big enough to handle our frustrations. God is big enough to handle our anger. And God is big enough to handle our questions.